Welcome in Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Happy Friday. John Alden with you, as always. And we got a lot to discuss today, And I guess for those of you who haven't seen this already, Jeff Goodman, by the way, I realize I'm going headfirst into the topic of discussion, at least the primary topic of discussion today, but I have reason for bringing it up so early. But Jeff Goodman last night put this up on social media, and I'll just read this verbatim what it says, in case you yourself have not seen this. He put, breaking, Indiana head coach Mike Woodson is contemplating stepping down and retiring, sources told at the Field of 68. The Hoosiers have lost 6 of their last 7. Woodson has lost the support of high-level boosters, and there have been ongoing discussions today about his future, source told the Field of 68. If Woodson does retire, the current plan would be for him to finish out the season. Indiana faces Michigan on Saturday at Assembly Hall. All right, so what does all that mean? Well, it means that the end is near, right? And so I guess let's just set the table for the rest of today's show. So obviously on Wednesday, we had it was just me. It was a solo episode, and it was very different style of show. Well, today we're doubling up on guests, and you're going to get a heavy dose of both, 30 minutes of both guests. First up, we'll bring on Alec Lasley to talk about this very thing. Not at first. So full disclosure, most, if not all of this show was recorded on Thursday night. And the tweet that I just referenced broke on, while I was recording with Alec about halfway through our conversation. So at about the halfway point of that discussion, if you're wondering why we haven't brought this up yet, it's because that was the moment that it became an actual piece of news. So Alec and I will discuss that and some other Indiana basketball related things, primarily that sort of stuff. And then after that, Jeffrey the Greek of the Eyes on Big podcast is going to come on to discuss some Indiana football matters and really just some Big Ten stuff, college football stuff as a whole, and kind of put a nice little bow on this past season. So we're kind of dipping into a couple of different areas today in heavy doses. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. And with that being said, let's go ahead and bring on Alec, because I'm sure you guys are ready to really dive into some of this Indiana basketball news that broke on Thursday. So from HoosierIllustrated.com, he is the one, the only Alec Lasley. Joining us once again from HoosierIllustrated.com, the publisher, the one and only Alec Lasley. Welcome back to In Touch with Indiana Sports, as always.
I appreciate it, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's almost the weekend, and I'm looking forward to catching up on some rest, honestly. So full transparency, I think the viewers probably know this. I'm recording this nearly the entire show on a Thursday. It's been a very, very interesting week, to say the least. But hey, we do what we got to do, and I'm looking forward to a little bit of rest this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. Should be nice. Obviously, we will see how the next few days go with Indiana basketball. Obviously, a lot of restless fans over the last couple of weeks, and I guess a good time and not a great time for a guy like Dusty May to walk into Assembly Hall. It'll be interesting to see the crowd reaction.
Yeah, especially coming off of the embarrassing loss that was the way things shaped out at Wisconsin. I mean, a loss to Wisconsin on the road is never surprising, of course. Indiana hasn't won there since before the turn of the millennium. But just the manner in which things occurred. I mean, you get down 24-4, less than 6 minutes into the ball game. And essentially from that point forward, you're out of it. I mean, you could have gotten a whole lot worse, of course. You end up only losing that game by 12. But to put yourself in that position, it doesn't give fans any reason to expect. And we've seen there's enough evidence out there already. This team, and the blame is probably on multiple people, but ultimately comes down to Mike Woodson. He's the one responsible for making sure things are running the way they're supposed to. But he just hasn't been able to figure out how to get this team to come out ready to play each and every game. And I don't know what we're going to see against Michigan on Saturday. But I mean, really anything is possible. We saw them look really good against Purdue, of course, and then the exact opposite when they traveled to Madison, the game right after. So if we're being honest with ourselves, I think it's a coin flip on what to expect on Saturday.
I think so, but I think the potential for IU to play at a much higher level, right, is probably at a much more minimal percent than you would look at the flip side. I just think this team is very much broken. I think at this point, I think the back-to-back losses there against Maryland and Purdue, I think really just took a lot out of them mentally, and I think that showed right to start that Wisconsin game because they really looked to have turned a corner in both of those games, even though they were losses, with their ability to take punches and then respond. And I thought that was the two bright spots of the last month here of what is now I think a 1-6 record, 1-7 record, and that's their ability to grow within that was at least promising. But you look at it now, and the lack of wins, right? The lack of opportunities that they have converted into wins, and now the loss to Wisconsin, which was multiple steps back from what they had done over the last week. It just looks like a team that's broken. It looks like a staff that's broken. It looks like a team that, again, just does not know what they can really rely on, what they can lean on, and a team that really just has no answers to any of the questions that continue to get thrown out each and every game. And you would like to see them be able to build on something, right? And be able to lean on something. Earlier in the year, it was, during that 5-game winning streak, it was their toughness, which has become a moot point at this point in the season. The team is, I think I talked about it, even in that Purdue game, towards the end of that, just how mentally weak they are, and that shows in late game execution. And then Mike Woodson brought that up after the Wisconsin game. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with the coaching staff, because this is now a consistent theme with any sort of team under Mike Woodson. Is just sometimes the lack of ability to really respond to any sort of tough situations that are thrown their way. Obviously Trace Jackson Davis, Jalen Hood-Schifino, right? Some of these guys masked a lot of what I think were very big cracks in what this program is obviously showing at this point. You had great leadership in the past. You had just great talent, NBA talent in the past, which you don't have on this team, even though from a college standpoint, I think you look at this roster and it probably on paper is the most talented team, like Mike Woodson said, of his tenure. It just doesn't translate to the next level. And I think that's going to be, the one thing that's going to be his biggest downfall is, probably the worst and biggest disappointing season of his tenure, which unfortunately likely will probably be his last, is the team that he had the most confidence in going into the year. And that's a difficult thing to look at when you look at what they brought in, the NIL that they spent, and then obviously all the talk and all the expectations going into this season.
And you already mentioned the elephant in the room for this Saturday, and that is, of course, the Dusty May factor when Michigan comes to town. And obviously, he's been a popular choice among fans, whether it was last season whenever he was making the jump from Florida Atlantic to a different job, which, of course, ended up being Michigan. I'm sure if Indiana ends up moving on from Mike Woodson, I'm sure he will be one of the first names that people throw out there, if he's not already being talked about a lot for this job, if it does open up. But at the same time, I mean, what if something, maybe this is, I don't want to spend too much time on this. It's just something that crossed my mind. What if Indiana goes out there and beats Dusty May this weekend? I mean, will that change some folks' opinions on, not on Mike Woodson, but on whether or not Dusty May would be somebody they'd want to seriously consider? Because one result is one thing, but I'm sure a lot of people, maybe even, especially when fans are thinking big picture type stuff, they probably want to see Dusty May come in here and really take it to Indiana to kind of show it. I don't want to say he's trying out for the job, but maybe fans will see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, so some fans probably will, but in all, honesty, that's not going to happen at this point, right? That
No.
ship is, and I think you know it too. That ship has, far sailed. That's not anything that's remotely close to a possibility. He's found his home, in Ann Arbor. He's built what is a really really good team in year one, and I think you see the culture that he's also established there in such a short period of time. That's not going to happen from an Indiana perspective, and I think even if he wasn't at Michigan and he didn't take the leap forward already, I think there's not a way that Indiana, assuming right, let's say they do move on from Mike Woodson, which again it's nothing is official about that
I don't
happening.
know. It's always weird to assume, but it's also we can't ignore the possibility when you get to this point in the season. I feel like,
Absolutely, and all the negative emotions from the fan base, right? That obviously
yeah,
shows more than anything. But um, after this experiment of bringing a former player back, bringing someone from Indiana back, right? I think
hmm
that ship of keeping it, quote unquote, in the Indiana family has passed as well. And I think it's something that they tried to do after the Archie Miller era to reignite what had obviously been such a strong fan base that was now very much out on Indiana basketball after those couple of seasons with Archie Miller to re-energize everyone, and they did, right. They went to back NCAA tournaments. They had a lot of really good talent. They started to pump out some more NBA players, something that they hadn't done in quite some time. But you're now at the point where you look at someone who was such an icon in the Indiana basketball community for such a long period of time, and coming back. I just you can't keep it in the Indiana family at this point, and so regardless of whatever happened with Dusty May, right? If he didn't take that Michigan
yeah.
job, and whatever the case may have been, last year, that probably wouldn't have happened, this upcoming season either way.
And a wrinkle that I don't know that I brought it up on this show, but of course, me being in the Louisville area, I was very much a part of all of the circles that were following the Louisville coaching search. And there was a point when Dusty May was believed to have, I don't know if he had accepted it, but he was on the verge of accepting the Louisville position. And then I guess he had received the offer from Michigan around the same time. And the hearsay with all of this is that he took the Michigan job over Louisville because there's less pressure involved with that job. And I'm not trying to knock Dusty May, and I'm not even saying that that is 100% how things played out. But if that were the case, I mean, you're always going to be second fiddle at Michigan to football, and you are at most places too. But at places, of course, like Indiana, and you can throw Louisville in there as well, basketball will always be a priority, and with that comes a lot of pressure. And we've seen Mike Woodson not really, he doesn't really handle the pressure from the fans very well. It's going to take whoever it ends up being, it's going to take somebody who is ready to embrace the expectations and at sometimes unrealistic expectations to perform at levels that I don't want to say that aren't possible to be met. And I realize we're kind of veering into maybe too much of big picture territory right now. We can move on from it after this. But it's going to take somebody who really is okay with when things kind of go on the south side a little bit and be able to respond to those moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have both ends of the spectrum, right? With Archie Miller, and then with Mike Woodson, you had a guy who was nowhere near connected to the fan base and to the media, but did a much better job communicating after games, and riding the ups and the downs. Mike Woodson, on the other hand, a little bit too much thinks he's above all of that.
Yeah.
We heard it last year, and this goes into another topic of conversation where I don't think the fan base would have turned as quickly or as much on him this year if the end of the season didn't happen last year, where he doesn't come out and say that the fans basically need to stop talking, and then Trey Galloway and Anthony Leal come out and say almost the same thing and echo that, right? And so all of that really just put a lot of pressure on this season. And obviously, for many different reasons, it has not gone the way that anyone had hoped. But he just seemed to always think and still, even to this day, right, still think he's a little bit above having to
Yeah.
answer to the fan base, because he was that bridge from the past and the future and the present, right? And was supposed to be that guy to reconnect all generations of the Indiana fan base. And so he thought he was kind of handed, the keys to the city to be able to do that. And yeah, that gives you a lot of runway to have kind of your ups and your downs, and still get the benefit of the doubt. But this is still obviously a results driven job, and you
Yeah.
need to be able to come out there and put a good product on the floor, and be able to do that year after year, because it's so easy to do that in a 1 year turnaround. And we've seen it now through multiple coaches being able to do that within 6 months, right, when they take the job. And we, obviously we're talking about Dusty May. We talk about Louisville too with Pat Kelsey and what he's been able to do. I mean, that program was in ruins over the
Yeah.
last couple of seasons with Kenny Payne, and he comes in and completely turns around that program, and does so with some major injuries too, and still
Yeah.
continues to have the team in the top 25, looking like a second weekend team when there were no expectations. And so it is 100% doable. It's 100% what's expected now. And with the backing, the NIL, and the fan base that Indiana does have, there's no reason why they cannot be a top 25, absolutely, but even a second weekend team every given year now, or at least the talent to be that, because obviously things happen, and you don't, no one's that consistent to do it year in and year out. But they have all of the tools at their disposal to do it. And you need a coach that understands the history, yes, but also understands that there hasn't been a lot of history in the past 2 decades, right? So
Yeah.
this is almost a program rebuilding itself, and trying to find itself in the new era of college basketball, and that's difficult to do. And I think it's even more difficult to do when you're so connected to the past of this program, when the program was at its best. And that's obviously kind of what you're seeing in this weird dynamic of, you have Mike Woodson, and everyone clearly knows he's not the guy. It's not working anymore. But he did also do a lot for this program back in the day. But you're more than at a crossroads, and you need
Yeah.
to go in the other direction. And it's just a difficult thing to do, but it's the needed thing to do.
We'll continue more of that side of the discussion at a later day. I'm sure, honestly, depending on how some of these results pan out over the next few matchups, I'm not expecting anything to escalate, unless things just really fall out, like the bottom really falls out, and you start seeing players kind of give up, and it just looks like a more of a disaster than it already is. I fully expect at this point in the season for Mike Woodson to be around at least until the season concludes. Uh, but if not, hey, we'll revisit that discussion as often as we need to. But one thing we really haven't done so far with you being on here is discuss what to expect from Michigan. Other than the fact that, of course, Dusty May is of course their head coach. What do you think Indiana can expect in terms of matchups?
Yeah, and it's a difficult matchup all around, right? Before we get into that, Jeff Goodman just posted again. This is Thursday night here.
Yeah.
That according to his sources, Mike Woodson is contemplating stepping down and retiring. So
Okay.
nothing totally new per se, but that's the first time that we've kind of seen anything of, I guess, quote unquote substance.
Yeah.
But that seems to be what the overarching plan, and what kind of all the um, rumors have been for
Well,
most of
while
Thursday.
you mention that too, then we can put this on hold, and we don't need to discuss too much about it anyway. In all honesty, but there was someone who commented on the show the other day, who had mentioned kind of best case scenario for Mike Woodson at the end of the season. Is the hope was that you could figure out how to finish the season gracefully, get some wins, don't completely ruin your reputation, and then just retire. You can say right off into the sunset. I don't know if many people would view it that way, at least at this point. But it also wouldn't surprise me if he's kind of being nudged by some people in the administration to go that route, because nobody at IU wants to let go of an alum, especially when things are kind of spiraling the way that they are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's again, what we were just talking about too is the difficult nature that this is, right? Someone who has been so connected to the program, and was such a big fixture of this program. Obviously, had such a great relationship with Bob Knight, and was a huge part of, again, bringing the multiple generations back together. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it's one that, again, everyone from the outside looking in and from probably the inside looking out knows is the best move for what's next in this program, because you can't, again, what we were just talking about, where things can be flipped in a positive way in just such a short period of time. You can't waste another year of trying to make this work when it's clearly not going to work. You're not in the day and age where you now give a head coach 4 years to figure things out. And that
No.
was kind of the Archie Miller approach, right? You want to give him the 4 years to get his players in, go through that full kind of recruiting cycle of 2 or 3 classes who are now in the college game for 2 or 3 years, and that's how you build a program. And then the transfer portal obviously hit. Then NIL, obviously hit. The COVID year hit, and so now you can flip the program in just a short period of time. So you can't waste a year anymore in college basketball. And I hate to say that that's what it was 5-6 years ago, because I don't think you ever really wasted a year. There's always growth or something that could come from it. But in the point that I'm making is, obviously you can't just keep waiting for things to happen. And the more reactionary that you get in college sports nowadays is going to set you back almost 5 years rather than 1 year. And so it's something that, again, needs to happen. I think everyone knows it needs to happen. Now it's just finding the most graceful way to make it happen. And regardless of however which way this eventually does come out, I think everyone does know that realistically he's going to be pushed out. It's not a Mike Woodson decision at this point.
No.
And so, again, it's just finding the most graceful way to have this exit and move on to the next era, which we've said this now for 2 coaches, but this obviously seems to be the big one here coming up, but probably the most important hire for Indiana in quite some time, because
and everyone, I feel like that's what people say every time there's a new hire, it's the next most important hire.
But again, after NIL and the transfer portal being as big as it is now even more critical to have a coach who can come in year one and do it, because you have seen it with so many other coaches around the country with less at their disposal, right? Indiana has everything they need to compete and be a top 10 program in the country. They just have fallen flat on their face for multiple years now, and have not been able to do that because of the leaders in charge.
Last thing that, if you don't want to do this, we can cut this from the segment, but this is something I do want to throw at least one name out there that I think would be a really good fit to take over if Mike Woodson does end up stepping down and or getting let go, however you want to view that as. But somebody that comes to mind, and not just me, I'm not throwing out somebody that's random, but this is somebody that does have some baggage, but I do think they are far enough removed from said baggage. If they hopefully, don't run into a situation or accusation like what they experienced again. But Chris Beard, currently at Ole Miss and previously at Texas, back whenever he had some allegations that I do believe were the charges for the domestic violence situation were dropped. I don't know if that means that they didn't happen or if there was an under the table deal, that sort of thing. But nonetheless, he is somebody who brought his Texas team to Assembly Hall during the COVID NCAA tournament, talked about how special, that building is to not only, IU, but just to basketball in general. And I believe I was talking with somebody the other day where Chris Beard had made another comment or something about I don't know. I shouldn't speak about on that because I don't have the exact.
it was after
You know what I'm talking
the
about?
game. Yeah, it was after the game when he referenced Bob Knight.
Yes,
Out
yes,
of the
that's what I'm
blue.
thinking
Yeah.
of. Again, it's just very, and that timing, of course, is weird as well. And so, because of that, I'm glad you remember that because I was about to start spinning my wheels trying to think of what that was. But definitely somebody that I think maybe it won't be on the top of everybody's list, especially when you think of the baggage that comes with him. But I think it's somebody that when you look at just the coaching itself and like that alone, I think that would be a home run style of hire for Indiana. Again, we don't have to talk too much about it, but if you have a name that you want to throw out there as well that you'd like that you think would be important to keep an eye on, I'm curious what your thoughts would be.
Yeah, and I mean that's it's right. It's an interesting name. I don't know. You want to unify the fan base
Yeah,
at this point, and I don't know if that's a name that does that. And I think right at the end of the day, all that matters is wins and losses. Let's be frank about that.
yeah.
But I think for a program that again has so much history, tradition, right, but hasn't done much in the last 2 decades, they still want to run things the right way. I'm not sure Chris Beard is that guy. I think he's a phenomenal coach. But I just don't know if he's the guy that you really want leading the program. Um, I mean, who knows, right? What happens, but um, you just hate to be involved in that kind of
Yeah, again,
domestic
that
violence
is the risk you
situation.
run if something were to happen again, and that's the last place that any program, especially IU, wants to be in at any point.
Right? Yeah. So I mean, look, I think the name that again, if this does happen, right, and which by all accounts it's going to happen now at this point.
Yeah,
Um, I think you probably have as good of a shot at Scott Drew as you're probably ever going to get. Um, Baylor has struggled a little bit more than kind of what was thought this season. He's a guy who still has a very fun, energetic offense. Can still recruit in the transfer portal. A guy who has obviously been sought after by every big name program that there is. But he's been at Baylor for quite some time, and
yeah.
at some point, as we saw with John Calipari, just making the tournament and maybe winning a game just doesn't cut it anymore. And obviously, he took that program from nothing into what they are today. So he's a big reason for what Baylor basketball is. I'm not taking that away from anything and having a down year, but it just seems like that ship with him staying at Baylor is closer to sailing than anything else at this point. And I think you have to take a shot at him. I think he can be, rejuvenated by a fresh start and a fan base that absolutely adores basketball just as much as he does, and vice versa. Um, Obviously, he was closely tied to the Kentucky job and turned that down last year.
Yeah.
But I think it's something where if it can happen, I think he's got to be one of those top two names. Who knows? Who else is out? I think Nate Oates is another name that people are going to talk about. I think that is no shot that happens. I think the one potential name, right, that may not have sailed at this point, right, is Bruce Pearl, a guy who
Yeah.
adores Indiana basketball and Assembly Hall probably as much as the fans do, if not
And
more.
what a time to get him right now when he has Auburn on top of the world
And so
this
I
season.
say that with what happens if Auburn goes and potentially wins a national championship. They're probably going to lose a large majority of that roster. Janai Broom is gone after this year, the potentially national player of the year, right? You still have a lot of good young pieces, but you also have a lot of guys who aren't going to be back. And if take Auburn to a Final Four like they did back in 2019, I think it was 2018, and then you bring them a national championship, there's nothing more you can do. Now you're kind of in the back half of your career, but still a guy who has a ton of energy and a guy who can obviously still recruit, can still coach, and a guy who gets a fan base super excited, and a team that always plays hard, no matter if they win or they lose. You're never going to be disappointed with the product that's on the floor with Bruce Pearl. It's just a matter of fact, or a matter of if he can get you over the top. And I think he's shown that over the last couple of seasons with what he's been able to do. That he's definitely a guy that can do that. Obviously, a guy who can just stabilize a program regardless. But I think if you're looking at any two names, in my opinion, those are the top two that you look after. And I think any year before this, I think there's no shot that you get Scott Drew. I think there's probably a little bit less hesitancy at this point from him. And then Bruce Pearl, right? It just depends kind of what happens with this season. But it's going to be interesting. I think you have to go with a guy who's proven it, a well-known name. I don't think you can take a shot at, and this is nothing against any of the non-Power 4 coaches who are looking to get up into the ranks for the first time. I just don't know where Indiana basketball is at the current moment if you can take a shot at a younger guy and hope it pans out, because then that's a tricky situation. If it doesn't, you're now 2 years removed from this year, and maybe you haven't made the NCAA tournament again in 4 years. That's a really difficult ship to get back moving in the right direction.
And last thing I'll say on basically building off what you were just mentioning, I mean, of course, Pat Kelsey was that for Louisville. Louisville took some shots to big names, one of those, of course, also being Scott Drew. And one thing that's intriguing about somebody like a Pat Kelsey, I'm not saying him specifically, but if Louisville went sort of that route, maybe you get somebody from a mid-major level, but maybe almost along the same lines as like what with Kurt Signetti was at James Madison. Like, yeah, he never had the big job, but he won everywhere else that he went. And when you're looking at that kind of specific category of coaches, you almost have to do a little bit more of a deep dive into who fits into that category, because a lot of those guys are they're not the flashy names that pop up on the big board. So of course Indiana will go for those bigger names first, but it'll be interesting to keep an eye on some of those low key results as well, in case the big names decide to stick with their current jobs. Because of course, as we saw last year with both Louisville and Kentucky, which they had Dan Hurley turn down the Kentucky job, of course, as well. That'll be interesting to see what happens if and when Indiana moves on from Mike Woodson. So Alec, appreciate the time. I good thing that broke while we were on here. It definitely added to the and I say it broke, like it's just
it's what everyone had kind of thought was going to happen. It's just it's finally out there by a notable name and not kind of through the back channels of anything.
Yeah. So again, Indiana does take on Michigan this Saturday. Does the result mean anything? I mean, maybe for how, again, gracefully ending the season at some point during these last several games. We'll have to wait and see what happens there. But Alec, of course, appreciate your time as always, and we'll do this again here very soon. Absolutely. Sounds good, John. Of course, a big thanks to Alec for his extended stay on the show. And I guess I can just thank timing for this, but I'm very glad that we had that piece of news to discuss during our conversation. But without further ado, we're going to transition into some football stuff. We're going to bring in Jeffrey the Greek of the Eyes on Big podcast, one of my favorite guests to have on the show. Hopefully you guys enjoy him as well. So without further ado, let's welcome in Jeffrey the Greek. Joining us now once again from the Eyes on Big podcast, it is none other than Jeffrey the Greek. Welcome back to In Touch with Indiana Sports, my friend.
Always great to talk to you. Here's the funny thing, folks. This is to the listeners. John and I just talk, right? I don't even know what we're talking about. I just know that we're talking about college football in some capacity. He's given me no clue. So you folks are going to find out what this info is, what these questions are right along with me. It's very exciting.
You and I both prepare for our shows very differently that I've learned. Whenever I've visited on your show, the Eyes on Big podcast, you usually forward me some sort of rundown of sorts, and I'll do that to you on occasion if I have something specifically that I want to talk about. But I've learned that if I have a plan, it's fine. But at the same time, I feel like sometimes my best conversations come out whenever there is less of a formal idea of what we want to talk about.
Yes, I like I like organic outlines, right? I want an
Yes.
outline, and then I want it to organically go from there. It's probably my Germanic. I'm not actually Greek, for anybody that's ever figured that out, and background. And then also I'm in sales, so like I have to have things that, you know, that's how it goes.
But I appreciate you just, you know, being willing to do whatever, because you kind of know we're wrapping up. We're putting a bow on the college football season. Since you and I last spoke, at least on this show, we haven't really talked about how things ended and looked ahead towards 2025. And I'll say this, as an Indiana fan, I'm just excited to talk football again in general, because normally this is the time of year when Indiana fans are super into what's going on with basketball.
Ooh.
Basketball has been, I don't want to say the most miserable time, but Indiana basketball fans would much rather go back to what was going on during the football season right now, because basketball is not really giving us much to be excited about at the moment.
Well, as they say, the Lord works in mysterious ways. So maybe in this case, because the basketball season was set up to be such a subpar situation, at least you have Siggy and the boys to save you there. So that's good.
Oh, yeah.
And there's things you can point to since after the season has gone on that has been good for Indiana football as well. So it's a lot more good stuff.
Yeah, a lot of good things. I'd say one of the biggest things that Indiana fans followed, at least for a while, was they kind of thought Brian Haynes, the defensive coordinator, might be leaving. His name kept getting mentioned for different jobs, whether it be for Notre Dame's OC, I believe Ohio State, whenever they lost, who was it? I almost said Al Golden. That was Notre Dame's. Yeah, whenever Jim Knowles, whenever he decided to step down, which really the Ohio State, the entire band broke up for whatever reason. And we can kind of get into that. It's been interesting to kind of see how the fact that they won a national championship and the way things have kind of occurred with, you know, I guess the aftermath with their situation. It's been very weird to see everyone just kind of move on or get promoted into different positions with them.
Yeah, those surprise. So with Ohio State, if we're kind of staying right there, you know, I think some fans, they get romanticized and they think maybe some guys are going to come back. Everybody that had the ability to leave for Ohio State's players, you knew they were leaving. Like you end on a high note. That's how you do it. You move on. So that wasn't a surprise whatsoever. With that being said, I really didn't see either Jim Knowles or Chip Kelly leaving. They both surprised me. Jim Knowles a little bit longer in the tooth. I thought maybe he would just kind of settle in to this really dream job, you know, being the defensive coordinator at Ohio State. But what do I know? He's a Pennsylvania guy, so he goes to Penn State. That was surprising. That job's still open unless I've missed something here on the Twitter sphere. And then
actually
Chip Kelly.
That was that Penn State DC job was the other one that Brian Haynes was being mentioned for, not the Ohio State one.
Gotcha. And then Charles Edward Kelly, Chip Kelly, that surprised me a lot, mostly because, again, I knew Chip did not want to be a head coach anywhere. That's my personal belief. Maybe in the NFL. Maybe he would be a head coach in the NFL. But I don't think he wants anything to do with being a head coach at college anymore. I thought he settled into kind of a perfect role for him. Like, you still get the glitz and glamour of being at Ohio State, but you don't have to be the head guy that gets the, you know, real big slings and arrows. But then he takes a different job. He goes to the NFL at a tune of 6.1 mil, which is just insane for me for a coordinator job in the NFL, which mostly comes down to how good is the quarterback that you drafted and, you know, have in your franchise. So those were surprising, but I had this weird feeling, John. You tell me what you think. I bet Ohio State will be okay. I bet they'll find some dudes to coach up the talent that they'll be able to acquire to get on their roster.
Yeah, and I was actually talking about really just the story of Ohio State in general, the way that things looked before the college football playoff, and then of course where they are now. I was kind of, I guess I should probably answer your question first whenever, so I don't just get completely off track. But yes, I think Ohio State will be just fine. They plug and play all the time, whether it be with their roster or coaches. I think they'll be okay. There's always going to be adjustments here and there, depending on different schemes and styles, whatever it may be. But I think they'll be just fine. But the way Ohio State was able to win the national championship in the dominant fashion in which they did in all of the games that they played in. I know Notre Dame gave them a bit of a challenge at certain points at the beginning of the CFP championship, but to see Ryan Day essentially being led to be crucified, and then now he's their hero. I'd be curious what it'd be like to be one of the fans who wanted to get rid of Ryan Day and just kind of do all that mental gymnastics and then now be where you're at. It has to be a very, weird predicament you were in just a few months ago to now.
I've asked a couple Ohio State fans some of these same questions. I'm not going to rat any of them out. My one buddy was pretty straightforward. He's just like, yeah, I wanted him gone, and now he's won me back. So from his point of view, that's his straightforward take on it. In all honesty, if I somehow an alternate universe, I was a huge college football fan just like I am, but grew up a Buckeye fan, I probably would feel somewhat the same, where you should expect a lot. You should have expected to beat Michigan at home this year. Any Buckeye fan has the right to be ticked that game, went the way it did. With that being said, we all went into the playoffs and said Ohio State still deserves to be in. And if they make some sort of run, this is going to change things. That's exactly what Ryan Day did. So this is life, man. I mean, if I could bring this back to sales, there's salespeople that have had really good, sales, couple 3-4 year run. Then all of a sudden something switches in their territory, things like that. All of a sudden it gets hard. Like these things happen, this is life. But Ryan Day got an opportunity in the 12-team college football playoff format. He took it home, and good for him. My only annoying thing is that's the Ohio State team that I thought we would see all year long. Maybe a loss out at Oregon, but everywhere else I just saw wins, dominant win. They never quite found that edge until Michigan got under their skin. So that's how she goes.
They were the magic antidote for fixing things.
I don't know how I would come to terms with that if I was a Buckeye fan, but I wouldn't take it back. I'll say that much.
And I guess kind of staying on the same lines with the championship, we're kind of seeing a power shift. And I'll be careful to say this because I know there are certain people, not necessarily viewers of my show, but if this for some reason happened to get onto some random show down south in the SEC, we've seen a power shift from the SEC to the Big Ten in the last 2 seasons, of course, first with Michigan and now Ohio State. And there was a lot of kind of denying of that before the college football playoff started and then seeing how things played out. Do you think this will kind of continue to be the trend? I'm not saying the Big Ten will win every single year, but I think we're heading in more of a direction to where the SEC dominance is done. I think from this point moving forward, the way things have kind of shaped out with transfer portal, players can kind of go wherever they want. I think you're going to continue to see more of a balance throughout college football until things change, of course.
I'll say what I want about the SEC. Come at me, bro. Come at me, SEC fans. I don't have anything too inflammatory to say here, but what I believe we have seen, I think this is pretty obvious. I think what we've seen here is the SEC did an amazing job of paying and keeping players in-house for about a 20-year run there. At some point, all of them SEC coaches and ADs and presidents got together and says, I know you're cheating, and I know you're cheating, but if we don't turn each other in, we can all cheat. And that is what has happened for a long time. Now, all of that money is right on top of the table for everybody to access. You have already seen this. Water down the SEC, water down the talent. This is what we got. This will be the new norm moving forward. Just like you said, though, that doesn't mean the Big Ten is going to win every single college football championship moving forward. I do think you are going to see a back and forth for the most part between the Big Ten and the SEC for who's going to look the best and take these college football playoff championships home. There will be a few other teams that I think can mix in there, but I don't know if I set the over-under for the next 10 years at how many non-Big Ten and SEC teams won a college football playoff, 1.5, how many right? I mean, that's a pretty good.
That's fair.
A pretty good poll.
You're being. I think I'm a little more generous with it. For some reason, my line would have been more along the lines of like 7.5, and I'm talking about in favor of 7.5 being those Big Ten SEC.
Big Ten SEC.
They get the opposite direction. That's
so I got a 1.5.
2.5 for me. Then
8.5. That you got to.
Okay.
I mean, we're 1 year apart, but that is kind of a big gap right there. So I would love to. We'll see how it winds up. But I mean, outside of Clemson, when you look back and project forward, it's been mostly Big Ten and SEC. And
that's fair to me. Who in the Big 12 is? I mean, if Arizona State is the class of your conference every single year, at this point, that's something to kind of shake your head out. And then who else in the ACC? Maybe Louisville has a run every now and again with Jeff Brom. I know they kind of had some head scratching losses this past season, but maybe they can get hot 1 year in the ACC with them. Who knows?
Not much else to pick. If Dabo can get things going again, maybe his former defensive coordinator gets fired at Oklahoma, comes back, and they get the magic going back together, something like that. I could see that. But, mostly the ACC has got 2 or 3 teams that really got to get their poop in a group if we're going to see them compete at the level of the top SEC and Big Ten teams. And as far as the Big 12, I joke and call them the kiddies table at family Thanksgiving. Maybe it's not straight kids, maybe it's like the middle schoolers, they've got a couple of fun, interesting things to say, but for the most part, you don't take them too seriously.
I like that. It's a little, I don't really know how. I think you couldn't have said it better. Middle schoolers versus the kid, like Mountain West. That's the kids table and all that sort of stuff.
Okay,
I like it's a little more prepubescent type stuff going on with the Big 12.
And it's not to say the real kids table or the middle school table isn't a blast.
Yeah,
doesn't mean there isn't that. Right, but let's just be honest. They didn't pay for the groceries.
I like that. One last thing with Clemson. Of course, Tom Allen now moving on to be the defensive coordinator at Clemson. Do you think that'll work out for him? Do you think that's kind of a weird it's not weird for Tom Allen per se, because he kind of fits that Dabo Swinney, personality, so to speak. But that's I don't know how it'll be long term. Maybe he just wants to settle down. He says his family's out in Clemson, or at least in South Carolina. Maybe he's done pursuing being a head coach elsewhere. Maybe I'm dead wrong about that, but who knows?
Yeah, it's amazing how what helps out the family always seems to be equal to the amount of pay that gets increased for the people that are making those changes. You make a great point, though. You make a great point, though. Crazy Tommy Allen is a better fit under Dabo than he was James Franklin. And it maybe took him a hot minute to get adjusted to personnel and what he wanted to do at Penn State. But I tell you what, by the end of the year, that defense was humming. Okay. And obviously he had talent to work with, but I think he'll have talent to work with at Clemson as well. So my prediction would be the Clemson's defense will take a step up next year. It really struggled stopping the run. I think it will get better in that capacity right away next year. I don't know if it quite reaches the stratosphere that he had Penn State playing at the end of the year.
Yeah, and I hate that Indiana, of course, they have Penn State on their schedule next year. They won't get a chance to play against their former head coach. But maybe they'll meet again in the if they happen to meet up in a college football playoff. I'm not necessarily predicting that in any way, shape, or form. But I do want to go ahead and jump into an early look at next season. And I'm sure you guys have broken that down. Maybe I'm wrong on what you guys have done with your newest Eyes on Big podcast. And if you haven't, I do plan on checking that. You just released that the other day. Today, I guess I should say. But
no, that was just
go ahead.
That was just an off-season catch-up. Then we're going to do some team grades pretty soon. We usually sandbag it a little bit before we start looking into next year. I like to kind of decompress.
Yeah, and I don't want to do any sort of deep dive into
we're good.
Any team or anything like that. But I am curious, just looking ahead, what are some kind of, since this is an Indiana show, we haven't talked a whole lot of Indiana just yet. What do you kind of expect from year 2 with Curt Cignetti next year?
Well, I'll just say this. It's hard for me to believe that Oregon, Ohio State, and Penn State won't be set up very well to get back to the college football playoff. So I'm just going to throw that out there right there. So then who has the best chance to be that fourth team? Michigan has to come to mind. Okay. If their uber 5-star quarterback and new offensive coordinator can get things figured out, they're going to be a tough team. You know, like 10 wins probably gets them into the college football playoff. They definitely have a chance. Indiana is right there too. So really, and I'm interested in what you say, but like, obviously there was a big talent drain for quarterback, but with them being able to get Fernando Mendoza in, who I really like, I think that was huge. I mean, people made it to be a big deal on Twitter because they should. So then the next thing is, okay, talent around him. Like, what did we lose? We lost a really good defensive lineman to the, that's going to go to the NFL draft. We've got a tougher schedule. I think that's fair to bring up to Hoosier fans.
Absolutely.
But how does that work together? Now that Indiana has some respect, if they can get to 10 wins and have 1 or 2 good wins in there and the losses are only to like excellent teams, I think that puts Indiana in a pretty good place.
Yeah, that's the difference between coming into next season versus last season. You now have a little bit of clout if you're Indiana, if I dare say a word like clout, as somebody who sounds as white as I do. But if Indiana does have a little bit of that going for them, they'll more than likely be somewhere in the preseason top 15, top 20, I would imagine. And I do think you're kind of spot on. If they can at least hit that double-digit win mark, it wouldn't be crazy to think they wouldn't find themselves at least in the conversation on that college football playoff bubble if they're able to get to 10 wins. But that route to double-digit wins, like you said, a lot more difficult next year. You have road games at your alma mater at Iowa. They have a road game right after that at Oregon, not in back-to-back weeks. There is a bye-week sandwiched in between those two games. Illinois at home to open up the conference slate in September will not be an easy game. Illinois is another team in the Big Ten who might be able to be, first-timers in the college football playoff next season.
For sure.
So those 3 games alone, and then throw in Penn State on November 8th as well. Maryland might be decent on the road. Who knows what they'll look like next year? It's definitely a more difficult schedule, at least right now on paper, because when you look at last year's schedule, before you played a game, you thought it might be difficult with you played both the national champion and national runner-up in Michigan and Washington, and both of those teams were just a little more underwhelming than people thought they would be. So the strength of schedule, you do have what it looks like before the season starts, but there's a really good chance that a lot of the expectations for certain teams that we're looking at now, those will have to be adjusted based on how things play out as the season gets rolling.
I mean, you're bringing up all excellent points. I agree with everything you said. And, to kind of go back to what we talked about in that, Indiana's got 2 things working for them as far as where they start with national perception. Number one, the year they just had, and the respect that I believe Siggy has, where people can look at Siggy and say, he's done this before. It's not like this is a flash in the pan thing like what we had with Mel Tucker and Michigan State, okay? So there's more to go off with Siggy. Last year, obviously, is a big thing that helps him out too. And I would say overall, the respect that the Big Ten has been getting more and more in that if you are the 4th place team in the Big Ten, I'm not saying Indiana is 100% going to be. They could be the 2nd place team. They could be the 6th place team, whatever. I'm just saying if there is a team like Indiana that is the 4th place team, that's going to help them a lot, especially if Indiana can notch a couple blowout wins right at the beginning of the year. If they don't start the season ranked in the top 25, my guess is they would very quickly get ranked. And now you have that a little bit more of a buffer for when you inevitably probably lose a game, Penn State, Oregon, something like that. That's huge. I mean, this is how the game is played, stupid or not for how you believe we go about it. But those are the advantages that the Hoosiers now have kind of baked in that they maybe didn't have last year.
I had mentioned Illinois earlier, how I kind of feel like they're going to be somebody to, not that necessarily, I mean, they were kind of, I don't want to say the overlooked team in the Big Ten last year, but they didn't get as much attention. I mean, mainly because they weren't near the top, but Indiana was, of course, one of the headline stealers when it comes to teams that normally overperform their usual expectations. What do you think Illinois can do to kind of maybe be that surprise team in 2025?
Yeah. So so many positive things going on that my podcast partner, Big Kurt, normally a dyed in the wool curmudgeon, is actually feeling positive about things. It's been interesting to see. That's quite the exorcism that Brett Bielema's done there. The one thing I would say, now I'm going to be a little bit pessimistic in. I think there's something true to the fact that you got to watch out when you bring back too many senior guys because they get a little comfy. So I think Brett's done a good job of mixing in a little bit of new blood from the transfer portal. I would also want to see some young blood that's maybe already on the roster rise up and be a spark. That would be the thing that I would most want to look for if I'm an Illini fan. But overall, when you return that much experience with your quarterback, I mean, that's the biggest thing with your quarterback. Illinois could be the fourth team in the Big Ten too, and if they finish 10-2,
I think I don't mean to interrupt. That game it's week 4 for Indiana. I don't know if there's, the way week 0 works and all that sort of stuff is real funky, but it's Indiana's 4th game. I believe it might be Illinois' 4th game as well. Indiana will have played nobody to really write home about in the first 3 games. I'm not sure how Illinois' schedule shapes up before then, but that could really be a booster point for both teams moving into the middle part of the season, I would say.
Huge. I mean, you could say the winner of that game, even though it's earlier in the season, helps them immediately for a college football playoff start or hurts them immediately for a college football playoff start. So that's a huge game. And then I'd like to point out, I think we will see Oregon, Ohio State, and Penn State all start very highly ranked to start the year. All 3 of those teams are almost for sure going to be in the top 10. Okay. Michigan, Indiana, Illinois. If I could put Iowa in there, I think Nebraska could take a step up. That sure sounds like a pretty good football conference to me that has a lot of depth to offer. Again, I hate to use it, but iron sharpens iron. That's 7-8 teams that I think you can list out pretty quickly inside the Big Ten, which means we're going to have a pretty compelling 2025 season in the Big Ten.
You went ahead and mentioned your Iowa Hawkeyes. They're a part of that brutal stretch for Indiana that includes Illinois, Iowa, and then Oregon in back-to-back games. How do you feel they'll be able to challenge Indiana next season? Of course, with the game also being at Kinnick Stadium.
Yeah, when you factor in Kinnick and I think Indiana and Iowa would be very close to each other as far as just ranking talent, from top to bottom on the roster. I think that's pretty fair. So what that means, I think it's going to be a pretty good game. Watch out, college football fans. We might actually have a quarterback that can throw a forward pass, maybe even complete somewhere close to 65% of his throws. So if that's what we have in Mark Gronowski, which I think we do, and Iowa fans hope we do, it should be, an improved offense after already taking a step up last year. There are some concerns on the defense, though. The defense needs to step up and look better than I think they did at times last year.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, of course, Indiana fans always think of that very scary, not a scary day, but it was scary if you're a fan. It was the opening game of the 2021 season, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. Of course, the expectations coming into that year after what happened during the COVID season, and the rails, or they just fell off the rails immediately. Michael Penix threw an interception on the opening play, and I believe the corner the defensive back that Penix threw the ball to caught a couple of picks that game, or a couple of pick sixes in that game, I'm not mistaken. So things fell off quickly for Indiana in that matchup.
Yeah, it was Riley Moss, the first Great White Hope quarterback, and then that folded into Cooper DeJean. So and Riley Moss doing very well in the NFL. So Penix didn't throw picks to a nobody. He's looked pretty good, but it's crazy. I mean, it's crazy when you think about that, though. People kind of forget that was a resurgence for the Hoosiers under Tommy Allen with Michael Penix. Kalen DeBoer. Right? It wasn't he the old coordinator at the time. I mean, gosh, you sit and look at that, that's a heck of that's.
I don't know if DeBoer. I don't think DeBoer was the coordinator on that team, but the year before he was. I think
so. He had already left to go.
He was DeBoer jumped ship before things got bad.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this: How different does that look if DeBoer is the offensive coordinator for one more year? If he stays in Bloomington for one more, and obviously you look back and you're like, wow, how did Indiana have a resurgence there for a little bit? Kalen DeBoer and Michael Penix, that'll help, right? I mean, that's a pretty good start right there. Funny what happens when you have a really good quarterback and coach.
It does. I do want to ask you about Indiana's arch rival, Purdue, and with Barry Odom now being their head coach. And if you don't know a ton about what they've got right now, that's totally fine. The one thing I can even mention that even it doesn't even really have much substance to it. When Barry Odom spoke with the media during their signing day the other day, he referred to Indiana as the opponent in red. And I guess he's trying to take a page out of the Cignetti book, because of course Cignetti, he's not afraid to say really whatever the hell he wants behind a microphone. I'm sure Barry Odom might be a little more restrained than that, but it'll be nice to see maybe a little head coach rivalrying going on between those two if they end up being competitive in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, Siggy probably talks shit at funerals. Like he's not. There's never a setting he doesn't like. I didn't know that about Barry Odom. I very much like that. That's interesting. I don't think it's being over the top disrespectful, but
it's not going into the basketball arena and yelling Indiana sucks and stuff like Cignetti did with Purdue sucks back whenever he was introduced to his crowd, of course.
But right now, as far as football is concerned, I mean, you want to do reversal, football and basketball with Purdue and Indiana right now. Like Max Clare, one of my favorite tight ends that played for Purdue. He's playing for Ohio State now. They lost a stud safety. You just go up and down the line. Anybody that was of significance that had the potential to come back, they're all somewhere else. So Odom did what he could. So the best positiveness you can give for Boiler fans is at least the transfer portal is a thing, so that you could, go out and try to replace. But methinks that Purdue fans are going to have to be very patient this fall and maybe even the fall after that until they're going to start seeing things look a little bit better. I do like Barry Odom. I think this is a much better fit than Walters ever was.
And speaking of Ryan Walters, he's not going to be away from the Big Ten. He's now going to be the defensive coordinator in Washington.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. Yeah.
Jed Fish had mentioned he thinks Ryan Walters, and again, he's going to talk up his guys, so I don't really blame him for doing this, but he says Ryan Walters might be the best defensive coordinator in the Big Ten. I just think that might be a little bit of nonsense coming from Jed Fish.
That's an actual quote from Jed Fish.
I don't have it verbatim, but maybe I got on social media.
But he said, right. We'll go under the assumption that he said that. That's a bold statement right there. There's a couple guys, maybe a defensive coordinator at Penn State right now that would want to say something about that. The Jim Broyles Award winner is in Iowa City from the year before, so it's a bold statement. I will want to see Walters do it again in a defensive coordinator position without being under Brett Bielema. Okay. So in my humble opinion, when that change happened, when Walters left, I think Brett Bielema hung on to one of the more talented guys in the roster, which is their secondary coach, now defensive coordinator. So I'm not saying Troy Walters can't coordinate a defense and teach guys how to tackle, but I'm just going to need to see it in the Pacific Northwest before I can brand him the best defensive coordinator in the Big Ten.
By the way, he said this is even a step further. It's best defensive coordinator in America. So that's, again, he's just gassing up his dudes, I guess, but it's something to say for sure.
That's impressive.
Let's we're coming up on 30 minutes here. Just kind of we'll wrap this thing up. I just want to hear your overall thoughts on really where things are heading. I'm sure you're already excited, as I am, for even watching spring football here in a couple of months. Not that the spring game ever really gives you a whole lot, but at least it's something to look forward to for when it comes to looking to the 2025 season in the fall.
Yeah. Well, I think the spring games, by and large, are kind of going by the wayside. But I will say this: if I haven't publicly stated this on Twitter or my own podcast, I will. Which is, I probably need to eat crow in that I complained a lot about the transfer portal and NIL when they were first kind of really getting unleashed on us old school college football fans 3 years ago or so. What I think maybe has happened is this could potentially open up a new golden age of college football.
As Joel Klatt has
in
said,
that
I feel like multiple times.
I think we really have the chance that you can see a spreading out of teams that you're going to be able to cheer for deep in the season. Okay. Meaning teams like Indiana getting into the college football playoff. Every Hoosier fan loved how that felt. I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but if Indiana can do it, there's a lot of teams in college football that can do that and get into the college football playoff. I think that's a good thing. Now, the next step is how many of these teams can win the college football playoff. We're 1 year in, and one of the bluest blue bloods that has ever bled blue just won it. Okay. So like, I'm not going to go so far to say it's like anybody could win this thing, right? I'll need a couple years, but if we get crazy where it's a non-traditional blue blood that wins it, now we're really cooking with gas at that point. If we can really think more teams have access to getting to the top of the college football playoffs.
But I do still think, I'm sure you've mentioned this and I mentioned this several times, without the expansion, Ohio State doesn't have a chance to do what they did and show that they are the best team, if that makes sense. Because they wouldn't have been in the 14 playoff.
No, they wouldn't have been in a 14 playoff. Absolutely. Okay. I thought you meant expansion in that the access to talent on their roster, but I misunderstood you. You're correct.
Maybe I misunderstood.
You're 100%. Nope, you said it right. I just interpreted it wrong. You're correct. Like, no chance they get in a 14 playoff. So yes, that is how that went down. And you can look at. I'm not the biggest NFL fan, especially this Sunday. But we have seen a ton of wild card teams get hot and make runs in the past with the NFL. That's what we got to a certain degree in the first year of the college football playoff. I think it'll start settling into, we'll consistently see the college football playoff winner coming out of the top 4 seeds. It was just really goofy how it worked out this year. They'll get that ironed out down in the future.
Yeah, especially, I mean, it's very odd. None of the teams that got a bye advanced from their bye spot. So very, very interesting how that worked out. And I do agree. I think they'll make some adjustments over time as they continue to tinker with the playoff format. But JTG, as always, appreciate your time. And I look forward to doing this down the line, whether it be sometime during the spring or as we get closer to media days, all that sort of thing. Feel free to give yourself. I mean, I know you do this for me on your show, but plug the Eyes on Big. Anything new that's coming up here in the next few weeks?
Yeah, give me a follow. I am at Jeffrey the Greek, like you see on the screen. The Eyes on Big podcast. You can also follow. We took a little hiatus there, but we're going to try to get 2 to 4 pods out a month now. Somewhere around 1 every week or every 2 weeks or so. The next thing up that we'll do is do team grades for the season that we just finished right there. Then we get into some fun stuff. We do the rankings pod where we re-rank the Big Ten coaches. That is going to be a fun one. We kind of debate through that. We do some other fun rankings that we do. I'll probably start getting some guests on here and there. So all Big Ten football. We try to talk about every single team. So come join us. Appreciate you letting me give the plug. And I had a blast. Maybe I should throw away my outline because us just kind of going at it here was about as fun as can be.
Hey, and you mentioned Indiana being in the playoff. Of course, I had to wear my college football playoff t-shirt today.
I was going to say, there's my gal Jennifer. She sent me a Sig 10 shirt. Hoosier fan. I just have it. Right. It hasn't got to its destination yet, but I'm hoping I can get that sometime soon. I'll wear it for sure.
Jeffrey the Greek of the Eyes on Big podcast. We'll do this again sometime.
See ya.
A big thanks to Jeffrey the Greek now as well for all he does for college football, for Big Ten football, and for coming on this show and all the discussions he brings to the table. So that's probably going to wrap up today's show. Of course, we've already gone past the typical time limit, and we've hit on all the big heavy hitting topics that we would have liked to get into. And we didn't really talk much Super Bowl, but we kind of talked about that throughout the week. And we'll have a lot to react to, on that front on Monday as well. And really, from what I've gathered, this is one of the weirder Super Bowls in recent memory when it comes to like the hype leading up to it. I feel like the hype is so so much lower. And maybe it's just because it's the Eagles and the Chiefs again. Maybe it's because people are just sick of the Chiefs in general, but who knows? But we'll react to that on Monday. And of course, we'll continue to follow everything that's going on with Indiana basketball and the Mike Woodson situation. I mean, maybe that's not the best thing to refer to it as, the development with Mike Woodson and his potential retirement, I guess is really what it is. So appreciate you guys as always. I'll get into more of your comments, and feel free. You heard us discussing coaches that you would like to see replace Mike Woodson. If you have someone you want to share, and we'll do this over the course of the next several weeks as well as this continues to move forward. But let me know who you want to see. Who's your top 2 or 3 choices? Let us know down below in the YouTube comment section, and we'll discuss those moving forward as well. So until Monday, this has been another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.